The Buddha taught, "Your words reflect your soul. Speak with mindfulness, act with kindness, and cherish the present." Each of us carries the capacity to heal and be healed, to forgive and be forgiven. In practicing these teachings, we not only better our own lives, but also bring light to those around us. Life is fleeting, but its moments, when lived fully, echo eternal truths. The sun bathed the city in a soft golden light as William walked briskly down the crowded sidewalk. His sharp features, framed by graying hair, bore the weight of years spent in courtrooms, arguing cases with a precision that left no room for ambiguity. Words were his craft, his weapon, and his pride. Yet those same words had cost him the most important relationship in his life: his daughter, Emily. It had been 7 years since their last conversation, an argument that had left wounds neither of them dared to address. William had accused Emily of being selfish, of abandoning family values for her ambition. She had retaliated, her voice trembling with anger, calling him controlling and unable to see beyond his rigid expectations. The words had flown like arrows, each piercing deeper than the last, until silence was all that remained. As he rounded the corner, William's steps slowed. A temple stood quietly amidst the urban chaos, its simplicity striking against the towering glass buildings. The faint sound of chanting drifted out, mingling with the hum of traffic. Something about the serenity of the scene pulled him closer. He climbed the stone steps hesitantly, almost as if seeking permission from an unseen force, and entered. Inside, a group of monks sat cross-legged in a semicircle around an elder. The air was thick with incense and an indescribable sense of peace. William took a seat at the back, unnoticed, and listened. The elder spoke in a calm, measured tone that seemed to settle into the very marrow of the room. "Words are like arrows," the monk began, his voice resonating with a quiet authority. "Once released, they cannot be retrieved. They may fly far and strike true, but they may also miss their mark, causing unintended harm. What remains is the wound, and no matter how much we regret, the arrow cannot be undone." William felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had always prided himself on his ability to wield words effectively, to outwit and outmaneuver his opponents. But now, he realized how often he had used that same sharpness against those he loved. Emily's face surfaced in his mind, her tear-streaked cheeks, the last image he remembered before she walked away. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The monk continued, sharing a story of a farmer and his son. One day, the father, in a fit of anger, scolded the boy harshly for a minor mistake. The boy ran away, his heart broken. Days turned into months, and the father searched tirelessly for his son, regretting his outburst. When he finally found the boy, the child's spirit had changed, hardened by the absence of love. "Regret is the heaviest burden," the monk said softly, "for it is a weight that cannot be lifted, only carried." The words struck William like a blow. His regret was a constant shadow, lingering at the edge of every achievement, every accolade. It whispered to him in moments of quiet, reminding him of the emptiness left by Emily's absence. He thought of the many times he had considered reaching out, but dismissed the idea, too proud or too fearful of rejection. Now, sitting in the temple, the weight of his silence felt unbearable. The elder monk paused, letting the silence stretch, as if inviting the listeners to reflect. Then, with a slight smile, he added, "But compassion has the power to transform. It does not undo the arrow, but it can heal the wound. To offer a heartfelt apology is not a sign of weakness, but of great courage. It is an act of love, and love is the greatest salve for pain." William's throat tightened. He realized he had been waiting for Emily to make the first move, to come to him and mend what was broken. But perhaps the monk was right. Perhaps it was his responsibility to extend the olive branch. The thought terrified him, yet it also sparked a faint glimmer of hope. As the session concluded, William approached the elder monk. "Your words. They speak to a part of me I have long ignored," he admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "I have hurt someone I love deeply. How do I begin to make amends?" The monk looked at him with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of centuries. "Begin with honesty," he said simply. "Speak from your heart, not your mind. Let your words carry the sincerity of your regret and the depth of your love. And remember, the outcome is not in your control. Release the arrow of compassion and trust that it will find its way." That evening, William sat at his desk, the faint glow of a desk lamp illuminating the blank sheet of paper before him. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his emotions: regret, longing, and an overwhelming desire to reconnect. Slowly, he began to write, each word a thread weaving together the fabric of his apology. By the time he finished, the letter was tear-stained, but his heart felt lighter. He mailed the letter the next morning, not knowing if Emily would respond, but trusting in the wisdom of the monk's words. As he walked away from the mailbox, a strange sense of peace washed over him. For the first time in years, he had taken a step toward healing, not only for Emily, but for himself. And in that act of courage, William discovered a profound truth. The power of words lies not in their ability to hurt or persuade, but in their capacity to heal. Rachel sat in the small kitchen of her modest home, her hands trembling slightly as she cradled a steaming cup of tea. Outside, the sun dipped low, painting the sky with hues of amber and crimson, but its beauty went unnoticed. Her mind churned with the events of the day, a whirlpool of guilt and self-reproach that threatened to pull her under. It had been a moment of frustration, a spill of milk, a child's innocent mistake. Yet her reaction had been anything but innocent. Her voice, usually calm and nurturing, had risen like a storm, unleashing sharp words that struck her young son, Ethan, like invisible lashes. His wide, tear-filled eyes replayed in her mind, haunting her even now. He hadn't said a word in his defense, only whispered an apology before retreating to his room. That silence, more than anything, was what broke her heart. She closed her eyes and tried to steady her breath. The monk's words, spoken at a retreat she had attended years ago, surfaced like a distant echo. "Anger," the monk had said, "is a flame. It burns everything in its path, including the one who wields it. To yield to anger is to invite suffering, both for yourself and for others." Rachel had always prided herself on her composure, on her ability to navigate life's challenges with patience and grace. But in that single moment, she had allowed anger to consume her, to spill out and scorch the very person she loved most in the world. She opened her eyes and stared into the tea, its surface rippling gently, as if mirroring the unrest within her. When the tea had cooled and her resolve had strengthened, Rachel stood and made her way to Ethan's room. The door was slightly ajar, and she peered inside. He was sitting on the floor, his small figure hunched over a sketch pad. She knocked softly and entered. Ethan looked up, his expression guarded but hopeful. "I wanted to talk to you," she said, her voice gentle. She sat on the floor beside him, feeling the coolness of the wooden planks beneath her. "About earlier, I was wrong to yell at you, Ethan. It wasn't your fault, and I'm so sorry." Ethan's eyes searched hers, and for a moment she thought he might cry again. Instead, he nodded slowly and said, "It's okay, Mom." But Rachel shook her head. "It's not okay for me to hurt you like that. You didn't deserve it. I need you to know that." Ethan hesitated, then leaned into her embrace. Rachel wrapped her arms around him, holding him close as tears slipped down her cheeks. It was a moment of healing, fragile yet profound, and she vowed silently never to let anger take control of her again. Later that night, after Ethan had fallen asleep, Rachel sat by the window, gazing at the moonlit garden. Her friend Anna's words came back to her, a reminder of the Buddhist teaching on mindfulness. Anger, Anna had said, is not the enemy. It is a teacher, pointing to the unhealed wounds within us. The key is not to suppress it, but to observe it, to understand its roots, and let it pass without acting upon it. Rachel realized her anger today had not been about spilled milk. It had been the culmination of weeks of stress, deadlines at work, financial worries, the endless balancing act of being a single mother. But instead of addressing her frustrations, she had allowed them to fester until they erupted in a moment of weakness. The next morning, Rachel made a conscious effort to begin her day differently. She woke early and spent a few moments in meditation, focusing on her breath and grounding herself in the present. She prepared breakfast with care, savoring the simple act of peeling an orange, of hearing Ethan's laughter as he recounted a dream he had. When the monk had spoken of anger as a flame, he had also said that mindfulness is the water that extinguishes it. By practicing mindfulness, Rachel began to see her emotions not as obstacles, but as waves, rising, cresting, and eventually subsiding. She learned to pause, to breathe, to choose her words with intention rather than letting them be driven by fleeting feelings. In time, Rachel noticed a change not only in herself, but in her relationship with Ethan. The house felt lighter, freer of the tension that had once lingered like a shadow. And in moments of struggle, when anger threatened to flare, she would remind herself of the monk's teaching: the storm will pass. It always does. What remains is how you choose to navigate through it. The journey was not without its challenges. There were still days when frustration bubbled up, when the weight of life felt too heavy to bear. But each time Rachel returned to her practice, to the simple act of breathing and observing. And with each small victory, she grew stronger, more attuned to the person she aspired to be. Rachel's story is a testament to the power of mindfulness and the strength found in vulnerability. In acknowledging her mistakes and striving to grow from them, she not only healed her relationship with Ethan, but also deepened her understanding of herself. Anger, she learned, is not an enemy to be vanquished, but a reminder of our humanity. A call to pause, reflect, and choose compassion over conflict. And in that choice lies the essence of peace. David's car rolled to a stop on the gravel road, the hum of the engine fading into the stillness of the countryside. He glanced around with a mixture of frustration and unease. A flat tire, miles from the nearest town, and his phone out of service, an inconvenience that felt disproportionately infuriating. As he stepped out, the air was heavy with the scent of earth and wildflowers, but David barely noticed. His neatly pressed suit and polished shoes seemed out of place against the sprawling fields and distant hills. A faint sound of footsteps broke the silence, and David turned to see an elderly man approaching. The man, with a weathered face and a straw hat tilted against the sun, carried a small toolbox in one hand. His clothes were simple, his boots caked with dirt, and his gait was slow but steady. "Need some help, son?" the man called out, his voice warm and unhurried. David hesitated. His initial reaction was to dismiss the man's offer. After all, what could this old farmer possibly do? But the reality of his situation left little room for pride. He nodded reluctantly. The man introduced himself as Henry and quickly set to work, inspecting the tire with a practiced eye. David stood awkwardly to the side, watching as Henry's hands moved deftly, his demeanor calm and assured. "City folk always seem in a rush," Henry remarked with a chuckle, glancing up briefly. "But out here, time works a little differently. You learn to respect it, let it guide you instead of trying to control it." David managed a polite smile, but said nothing. He was used to the pace of the corporate world, where every second was a commodity, and success was measured in deals closed and numbers climbed. The simplicity of Henry's world felt almost foreign, a relic of a past he had long since left behind. When the tire was finally replaced, David offered Henry some money, a gesture of formality more than gratitude. But Henry waved it away. "Just glad I could help," he said, tipping his hat. though I reckon you might be the one who could use some help, if you're willing to hear a stranger's thoughts." David was taken aback, but curious. "What do you mean?" he asked, his tone cautious. Henry leaned on the handle of his toolbox, his gaze steady and thoughtful. "Sometimes we get so caught up in chasing what we think matters, money, power, recognition, that we forget the real treasures in life. Kindness, patience, understanding. Those are the things that stick with you long after the rest fades." David felt a flicker of defensiveness rise within him, but it was tempered by a strange sense of humility. There was something disarming about Henry's words, spoken without judgment, only sincerity. "Not everything is as it seems, son," Henry continued. "You see a man covered in dirt and think he's got nothing to offer. But every person you meet carries a story, and some of those stories might teach you more than any book or business deal ever could." As David drove away, his mind churned with the unexpected encounter. He had always prided himself on his ability to read people, to judge character at a glance. It was a skill that had served him well in business, allowing him to navigate negotiations and alliances with ease. But Henry's words lingered, unsettling in their simplicity, yet profound in their truth. Days turned into weeks, but the memory of that quiet conversation refused to fade. David began to notice how often he dismissed people based on surface impressions. Waitstaff at restaurants, janitors in his office building, strangers on the street. Each interaction felt transactional, devoid of genuine connection or understanding. One evening, while attending a charity gala, David found himself seated next to an older woman dressed in modest attire. Her presence seemed out of place among the glittering gowns and tailored tuxedos. Curiosity got the better of him, and he struck up a conversation. To his surprise, the woman, named Margaret, was the founder of the very organization the gala was supporting. Her modesty belied a life of incredible achievements, including decades of work advocating for underprivileged communities. As Margaret spoke, David felt a pang of shame for his initial assumptions. He thought of Henry's words and realized how often he had missed opportunities to learn from others simply because they did not fit his preconceived notions. That night, as he lay in bed, David reflected on the Buddhist teaching of anatta, the concept of non-self. The ego, with its constant need for validation and superiority, blinds us to the interconnectedness of all beings. To judge another is to judge oneself, for we are all reflections of the same essence. Slowly, David began to change. He made a conscious effort to approach each interaction with openness and curiosity, seeking to understand rather than to evaluate. He found himself listening more, speaking less, and discovering stories he never would have imagined. In time, these small shifts transformed not only his relationships, but also his sense of purpose. The success he had once chased now felt hollow compared to the richness of human connection. He learned to value people for who they were, not for what they could offer him. And in this newfound humility, David discovered a profound truth. The greatest wisdom often lies in the most unexpected places, and the most ordinary encounters can hold extraordinary lessons. For as the Buddha taught, the lotus blooms in the mud, and so too does the beauty of life emerge from its simplest, humblest moments. Samantha paced the narrow hospital corridor, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The soft glow of the fluorescent lights cast long shadows on the white walls, their hum barely masking the rhythmic beeping of monitors from nearby rooms. She felt the weight of exhaustion pressing on her shoulders, a burden that seemed heavier with each passing shift. Her dedication as a nurse was unwavering, but lately, the balance she had fought so hard to maintain was slipping. The hospital was her second home, a place of both healing and heartbreak, where the fragility of life was laid bare daily. But tonight, as she stood outside the room of Mr. Carter, a terminally ill patient, Samantha felt an ache deeper than physical fatigue. It was the kind of weariness that came from giving and giving, with little left for herself. She leaned against the wall, closing her eyes for a moment, but the sound of her name pulled her back. "Samantha?" The voice was soft but insistent. She turned to see her colleague, Laura, beckoning her. "Mr. Carter's asking for you." She entered the room quietly, her steps instinctively light. Mr. Carter, a man in his late 70s, lay propped against a pillow, his face pale and etched with lines of both pain and wisdom. He smiled weakly as she approached, and despite his frailty, there was a warmth in his eyes that never seemed to fade. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have much time left, but I wanted to say something." Samantha pulled a chair close to his bedside, her hands gently resting on his. "I'm here," she said, her tone steady despite the lump forming in her throat. He took a shallow breath, his chest rising and falling slowly. "You remind me of someone I loved deeply," he began. "My daughter. She passed away many years ago, and I never had the chance to tell her how much she meant to me. I took her presence for granted, assuming there would always be more time." The words hung in the air, heavy with regret. Samantha felt her own heart tighten as he continued. "You've shown me kindness and patience that I didn't deserve. It's a gift, you know, to give of yourself like that. But don't let it break you. Sometimes we carry so much for others that we forget to carry ourselves." His eyes met hers, and for a moment it felt as though he was looking into her soul. "Promise me," he said softly. "Promise me you'll take care of yourself. The world needs people like you, but you can't pour from an empty cup." Samantha nodded, her voice catching as she replied, "I promise." She stayed with him a while longer, holding his hand until he drifted into a peaceful sleep. When she finally left the room, she felt both humbled and shaken. His words had stirred something within her, a realization she had long ignored. In the break room later that night, Samantha stared at her reflection in the small, smudged mirror above the sink. Her face, though still youthful, bore the signs of sleepless nights and unspoken worries. She thought of Mr. Carter's plea, the weight of his regret, and the wisdom of his parting words. Compassion had always been her guiding light, but she had begun to confuse selflessness with self-neglect. She had given so much to others that she had forgotten to care for the one person who made it all possible, herself. The next morning, Samantha woke early, the faint light of dawn filtering through her window. She sat on her bed, her hands resting on her lap, and began to meditate, a practice she had learned years ago but abandoned in the chaos of life. As she focused on her breath, a sense of clarity washed over her. The teachings of the Buddha came to mind. Compassion is a gift, but it must begin with oneself. Without self-care, even the noblest intentions can lead to suffering. In the weeks that followed, Samantha made small but meaningful changes. She set boundaries at work, learning to say no when needed. She reconnected with old friends, finding solace in their laughter and shared memories. She even began painting again, rediscovering a passion that had long been buried beneath her responsibilities. These moments, though fleeting, became a source of strength, a reminder that balance was not a luxury, but a necessity. Her transformation did not go unnoticed. Her patients still received the same warmth and dedication, but now there was an ease in her presence, a lightness that had been missing. Her colleagues, inspired by her example, began to reflect on their own practices, creating a ripple effect that brought a renewed sense of purpose to the entire ward. One evening, as Samantha walked through the hospital garden, the cool breeze brushing against her skin, she felt a profound sense of peace. She thought of Mr. Carter, whose life had been marked by both love and regret, and felt gratitude for the lessons he had imparted. She had learned that compassion was not a one-way street. It was a circle encompassing not only those we serve, but also ourselves. The garden was quiet, save for the soft rustle of leaves, and Samantha closed her eyes, letting the stillness seep into her. She understood now that true compassion was not about martyrdom, but about balance, an act of giving that nourished both the giver and the receiver. In this realization, she found not only healing, but a deeper connection to the essence of her work and her life. Lucas sat by the window of his study, the late afternoon sun casting golden rays across the shelves of books that lined the walls. The room was quiet except for the rhythmic ticking of an old clock, a sound he had grown so accustomed to that he rarely noticed it anymore. Today, however, it seemed louder, as though each tick was marking a moment slipping irretrievably into the past. He stared at a photograph on his desk, a candid snapshot of his late wife, Marie, laughing in the garden. It had been nearly a year since she passed, yet her absence felt as sharp as ever. The silence in the house was no longer peaceful. It was oppressive, filled with echoes of things unsaid, of time that could never be reclaimed. Lucas had spent his life meticulously planning for the future. A respected professor, he was known for his intellect and foresight, qualities that had earned him both professional acclaim and financial security. Yet, for all his success, he felt empty. His achievements, once a source of pride, now seemed hollow in the face of Marie's absence. He had been so focused on building a future that he had forgotten to live in the present, a truth he could no longer escape. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Emma, his granddaughter, her face flushed from the autumn chill. "Grandpa," she said, her voice bright, "can we go for a walk? The leaves are so pretty today." Lucas hesitated. His instinct was to decline. There was always another paper to review, another task demanding his attention. But something in Emma's hopeful expression reminded him of Marie's gentle chiding whenever he became too absorbed in his work. She would often say, "Life isn't waiting for you to finish your to-do list, Lucas. It's happening right now." He nodded, grabbing his coat, and they stepped outside. The crisp air carried the earthy scent of fallen leaves, and the world seemed alive with color, vivid reds, oranges, and yellows that blanketed the ground and adorned the trees. Emma skipped ahead, her laughter ringing out as she kicked a pile of leaves, and Lucas found himself smiling despite the heaviness in his chest. As they walked, Emma picked up a particularly vibrant maple leaf and handed it to him. "Isn't it beautiful?" she asked. He turned the leaf over in his hand, marveling at its intricate veins and the way the sunlight illuminated its fiery hues. "It is," he said softly, struck by the simplicity of her observation. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly present, his mind quieting as he focused on the world around him. They reached a park bench, and Emma climbed up, her legs swinging freely. "Do you miss Grandma?" she asked, her tone curious rather than sad. Lucas sat beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Every day," he admitted, "but I also regret the times I didn't appreciate her enough when she was here. I was always so busy with work, thinking there would be time later. But later doesn't always come." Emma frowned thoughtfully. "Grandma always said you worked hard because you wanted to take care of us." Lucas smiled faintly. She was kind to see it that way, but in trying to take care of the future, I forgot to take care of the present. The conversation lingered with him long after they returned home. That evening, as he sat alone in his study, he found himself reflecting on the Buddhist teaching of impermanence, anicca. Everything in life is transient, a truth he had understood intellectually but failed to embrace emotionally. He had spent so much time trying to hold on to things, to control outcomes, that he had resisted the natural ebb and flow of life. The next day, Lucas decided to make a change. He began setting aside time each morning to meditate, focusing on his breath and the present moment. He started keeping a journal, not to record grand accomplishments, but to capture small joys. The warmth of the sun on his face, the sound of Emma's laughter, the taste of a perfectly brewed cup of tea. These moments, fleeting as they were, became his anchors, grounding him in the now. As weeks turned into months, Lucas found himself reconnecting not only with his family, but also with himself. He joined Emma on her walks, helped her with school projects, and listened to her stories with genuine interest. He reached out to old friends, rekindling bonds that had faded over time. Each interaction, each moment of connection, felt like a gift. A reminder that life's beauty lies not in its permanence, but in its impermanence. One evening, as Lucas watched Emma play in the garden, he felt a profound sense of peace. He thought of Marie and the life they had built together. While he would always miss her, he no longer felt consumed by regret. Instead, he felt gratitude for the love they had shared, for the lessons she had taught him, and for the chance to honor her memory by living fully in the present. Lucas's journey was not without its challenges. There were days when old habits resurfaced, when the pull of his past ways threatened to overshadow his newfound clarity. But each time, he reminded himself of the wisdom he had learned. Life is not about clinging to what was or fearing what might be. It is about embracing what is, with all its imperfections and fleeting beauty. In the quiet of his study, surrounded by the echoes of a life well lived, Lucas wrote a letter to himself, a promise to carry forward. I will not let the fear of loss steal the joy of today. I will cherish the moments, however brief, for they are what make life whole. And as he sealed the letter and placed it on his desk, he felt a lightness he hadn't known in years, a quiet but unshakable belief that even amidst life's impermanence, there was always room for love, for connection, and for peace. As the seasons shifted and time wove its quiet tapestry, the lives of William, Rachel, David, Samantha, and Lucas converged on one shared truth: the profound beauty of the present moment. Each of them had wrestled with their own storms: regret, anger, judgment, exhaustion, and loss. But through these trials, they found clarity in the simplest yet most elusive of lessons: to live fully and to love deeply while the chance still remained. William, humbled by the wisdom of compassion, discovered that the courage to apologize could mend even the deepest wounds. Rachel learned to tame the fire of anger with the cooling waters of mindfulness, nurturing her relationship with Ethan in ways she had once taken for granted. David, shedding the armor of his ego, began to see the humanity in others, uncovering the extraordinary in the seemingly ordinary. Samantha, inspired by the wisdom of a dying man, embraced balance and self-care, learning that compassion must flow both outward and inward. Lucas, finally at peace with the impermanence of life, cherished the fleeting joys that made his days whole, finding love and connection where regret had once lingered. Their journeys were a testament to the teachings of the Buddha, that life, in its impermanence, is not a race to be won or a treasure to be hoarded, but a fleeting gift to be savored with open hearts and mindful presence. Their stories remind us that every moment, no matter how small, carries within it the seed of transformation and the power to heal. As we turn the final page, let us carry their lessons forward in our own lives. For as the Buddha so beautifully taught, the trouble is, you think you have time. But in truth, life is now, its beauty unfolding in the present, waiting to be embraced.